4 decades in ministry of one kind or another, all in pastoral ministry of some kind, you do kind of formulate, well, I wish I had done this, or I'm really glad I did that. If I was to kind of hit both ends of that question, I would say, let's start with the positive. Something I think really is important is, and I didn't always do this well. I came right out of Bible school. I headed into ministry. That first church, I was full time. It was CCC here. It wasn't called CCC then. I was an assistant pastor. I was at the church and part time at the Bible school. That was a good season. The next church was a wonderful church in St. John, New Brunswick. It's about an hour and a half from here, same province of Canada. But just the financial impact of that, every decision I've ever made in ministry the salary always tended to trend downward. And so I remember in St. John at one point, for a good part of that 8 years, I was working 3 jobs. The church, I taught all day, Monday to Friday at either the community college or a computer college. And then just to make ends meet, Beverly was home with the children. I'm trying to remember what they called us. We were some kind of representative, but really what we were was a night shift watchman over the YMCA. And I worked the front desk, and it was security, registration. We had a hostel. We had all kinds of hostile, crazy people that came in. It was really kind of trying to keep them from destroying the place in some ways. So that was a very intense time, actually. And so I'm not just rambling. I'm coming to your question. I would say that one of the things that I would really strongly urge all young ministry potential kind of people is work on you and work on your personal relationship with God. Because right out of the gate, you can become so very intensely busy in the tasks of ministry, especially if you're in the second chair or the third chair. You're an assistant, you're doing task-oriented things. This is wonderful. It's how the New Testament is structured. This is what Acts 6 is about. Let's get some younger men that can take these menial tasks away from the apostles, the spiritual leadership, so that they can have time to get with God and get in prayer and get vision for the church. So it's structured biblically. But you can get, especially if you're like me and you're type A driven, task oriented, you can get so devoted to busy things. And if I had it to do over again, I worked hard, but it was just a very time consuming time in my life. So many different things, different jobs, and so many tasks. I would really urge young leaders, work on your personal commitments, your personal relationship with God, because those years, they pass so quickly. And when I look back, the times that I spent in study, the times that I spent in the Word, even though it was harder to do then, it wasn't my sole responsibility then. It's so valuable, that kind of thing. And then I would come around to your question in a different way, because sometimes we can make mistakes by getting ahead of God or getting out of alignment with God. Getting ahead of God is a very common one. Sometimes young leaders get destination disease, is what I call it. When I get there, if I get that role, when I'm full time, when I have a paycheck from a church, when they give me a title, a position, a church office, a church key, then I've arrived and I can do something for God. That's just destination disease. And I always tried to bloom where I was planted. The other thing I would say is, from my first job in ministry, I got fired. Not many people know that. You just raised your eyebrows. I gotcha. So the reasons for that behind the scenes that no one knew at the time were that the senior pastor and I and him and the staff, they were on one side, I was on the other side. He was going a different direction doctrinally. And it ended up in a church split. It ended up in him leaving the apostolic movement altogether. So he fired me, and I look back at that time and it shattered me. It was my first job in ministry. And it just seems so cruel. And, here I've given up university and I've embarked on this thing for God, and first job. And a few years later, literally I get called into the pastor's office, and this isn't working and you're done. And I could have got bitter. I could have been so distraught and destroyed that I just threw up my hands. But the other thing that could have happened to me, it was a doctrinal difference. I remember distinctly for about a year after I got fired, when I would hear a preacher preach on the grace of God. Because just like the Nicolaitans in the first century, at the end of the first century, this doctrinal diversion was abusing the grace of God. We can live any way we want. We're saved by grace, blah, blah, blah. And so for about a solid year, if I would hear a preacher preach on the grace of God, I would be arguing with him in my mind. And I knew it wasn't right. I knew that I was out of balance. And thank God I just kind of stayed plugged in until that year passed and I came back to balance. Because, sometimes when people hurt us or when they go one direction, the pendulum tendency is, well, we're going to go the other direction and we're going to become really harsh and hardline and whatever. Well, that doesn't solve anything. Now you've got two people out of balance. But here's the big lesson for me from that season is I never lifted my hand or my voice against him. In fact, I never talked about this. Only my parents knew about the situation. I had people in that church. We were still living here. In fact, because I went from there to the Bible college, we were still attending that church where I had worked. And wow. Every week, Pastor Greg, people would come. Why did you leave us? We love you here. We want you here. Why did you just pick up and leave? And I never said a word. I never said I got fired. Because I could see things that the saints couldn't see yet. Fast forward many years later. I mean, you're talking that's 30 years ago, probably, or even more. Time has proven that I was going the correct direction and he was going a different direction. Time has proven that, for lack of a better term, I'm right, he's wrong, if you want to say it that way. But I would have been wrong if I had lifted up my hand against him. I never could have come back to that church as senior pastor because those people would have seen me as someone who attacked their pastor. And so I would say to young leaders, kind of from the negative side of things. So we talked about, do your personal disciplines and dig in there. That's so important. But on the other side, when bad things happen, and sometimes they do, when you feel like a leader's against you or a leader's putting you in a box or he won't let you progress or he's a hindrance to the furtherance of your ministry, it's the word that everybody loves to hate. Just submit. Don't get out of alignment with God. There could come a situation where somebody has to leave because of doctrine or whatever, but don't take it upon yourself as a young leader. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to rise up, because all you do is you damage yourself. You damage yourself in the eyes of the church. You damage yourself in your relationship with God, because now you've taken it upon yourself. There's a reason the scripture says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And although there are other things that I think I did right, I've told young leaders for years now, that's probably the best decision I ever made as a young leader, that I didn't lift my hand against a leader that was over me that I knew was wrong. And the closest thing I can come to in scripture is David and Saul. David knew Saul was wrong. Saul didn't have an altar. Saul didn't care that the Ark of the Covenant had fallen into the hands of the Philistines for so much of his reign in the early years. And when the Ark did come back, he just left it on the fringes of Israel. David's king for 5 minutes, and it's like, we got to go get the Ark. But David never lifted his hand against Saul. And sometimes God allows Sauls in your life. It's to grow you. So number one, dig in personally. That's the positive side. Your personal disciplines in the word and in prayer, in every way that you can serve God personally. But on the flip side of that, don't get out of alignment by getting ahead of God, trying to fix things, trying to raise up, and I'm going to take this in hand. Learn to trust God. And my goodness, I'm a testimony that years later, I'm now the teaching pastor and the bishop of that church. That would never have happened if, as a 20-something-year-old kid, I just strutted my stuff and I'm going to fix this and I'm going to raise up and become the loyal opposition to this guy. It would never have happened. So I just kind of bided my time and trusted God. And that's so important. That happens to a lot of young leaders.